All right, y'all, March is here, and it's time for another round of excellent drops here at H&S. And this morning, it is the Ides of March, so be careful out there today. But that's not too much of a consideration here at H&S as we have some beautiful coffees to get to. So let's jump right in. And we're starting off the month with a really nice, beautiful, clean, and sessionable coffee. This is El Tropico. This is a community lot from Huila and is imported to me by Kima Coffee. Despite it being a community lot, a field blend of Caturra and Colombia, this is part of Kima's Reserve series, and it really shows with the very impeccable processing on this coffee. This is a really beautiful looking coffee, very consistent. It's very, very nice and clean in the cup. Being a Caturra based field blend, this coffee offers a ton of sweetness to it and a lot of citric and stone fruit flavors in it. Very hallmark for the variety and for the region in which it comes from. It's got a really nice tartness to it. It's very juicy. The finish is excellent on this coffee. It really finishes clean and it finishes juicy. So you're gonna see a lot of juiciness left over on the palate. There's really no dryness or any astringency to this one, partly owing to its roast profile as well. Really clean, really great sweetness, and a really punchy acidity to it. It's kind of the whole package when it comes to having something that's very nice and sessionable, easy drinking, easy to brew sort of coffee. And the notes that we've got on this one are peach, orange blossom, and black currant. That black currant on the finish, really, really tart, and it kind of has a little bit of a Kenya-like tartness to it. But obviously we're talking about a Huila, a washed Huila Caturra, so I wouldn't go too far with that comparison, but definitely that tartness on the finish especially kind of reminds me of some of those really nice tartar Kenyans when it comes to that black currant note on the finish. A really, really enjoyable cup, very sessionable. This lands in the bag slot number 1 for the Roaster's Choice for March. So if you're a Roaster's Choice subscriber, this is your bag number 1. No muss, no fuss, just a really nice, clean, sessionable coffee. Dare I say, I've brought this up before in the past, and it's been kind of difficult for me to actually find these types of coffees, but this is legitimately a boring washed coffee. Tongue-in-cheek for all y'all out there who know what I'm saying. Regular wash process, Caturra field blend from Huila, Colombia. Just exactly what it is, nothing that it isn't. Okay, moving on to our second drop of the month, and this one's got a lot of hype around it. It's got a lot of expectations. It's got a really high bar, and it is, of course, Ecuador Arashi. What can be said about this coffee? This coffee was one of the best coffees from last year. The sweetness, the acidity, the complexity, the florality, a big package. And last year it was sort of a breakout hit and kind of started a pretty big hype train for H&S as a lot of people picked this one up. A lot of people enjoyed it. Coming into this year, I knew expectations on this coffee were going to be sky high, and it really, really matches those expectations, I think. The profile's a bit different from last year, both in the flavors that are coming off of the green and what it's presenting to me, as well as how I have treated this coffee this year compared to last year. It's a beauty. This coffee is produced by Abel Salinas, one of Ecuador's very best producers, a past Cup of Excellence winner, and this lot in particular has so much hype and so much going for it that Abel is able to command a higher pricing on this lot year over year. And as long as the quality keeps going up, the price is justified. We're entering a new era for coffee buying, for me, for the consumer, where you're going to start seeing a lot higher prices on coffees, folks. Like, you got to get used to it. And as producers are able to produce coffees like this, of this quality, they have a lot more say and a lot more command over what they're pricing their coffees at. And this is a fine example of something that is expensive and worth it. It's a beautiful, beautiful cup. This is a wash measurado. And I've got, for the notes on this one, lemon limeade, sugar cane, and violet. And if I think back to the notes from last year's Arashi, we had pear, we had marshmallow, and we had, I think, lily, or another sort of, or it was orchid, a exotic, pungent floral character to it. The difference this year on this lot is that this coffee has quite a bit more acidity to it that is presenting in the cup, and that acidity is really citric, and that lemon limeade note is pretty true to the character of this coffee. It's very sort of shocking in the brightness that it's showing. Second up, with that sugar cane, this is both a component of the variety itself, a measurado, and it's also a part of my stylistic choice on the coffee this year. So last year we listed marshmallow, and that was a little bit more of a developed sugar. This time around, with this roast profile, the sugar development's a little more transparent, and so we've gone with sugarcane to represent that. And sugarcane, just sort of a pure sweetness vibe, and it attaches itself to every little bit of this coffee. You're going to find a sweetness across the board, across the entire sip of this cup. And finally, finishing with violet, another pungent floral, another floral note to represent complexity in this coffee and an overall amount of floral intensity that is present in this coffee. This one really makes me smile. The lemon limeade note on the top, it's really nice. It's clean, it's very intense. It's not bracing, and it's not astringent. And the complement of the sweetness across the whole sip in this coffee really ties into just that shocking lemon limeade up front. Lots of sugary sweetness to it, a lot of floral complexity into the finish. It's brilliant. It's a beautiful coffee. And this falls into the Roaster's Choice bag slot number 2 for the month. So if you are a 2-bag subscriber on the 2-bag plan, this is your second coffee for the month, and I'm so happy that I got to put this into the Roaster's Choice subscription for the month. This is why I made all those changes to the subscription a couple months back, so that I can start putting coffees like this into the subscription. Spectacular. Oh, man. Lemon limeade, truly. Okay, moving on to non-subscription drops for the month. We have 2 non-subscription drops this month to cover, coming from the most ancient heritage for coffee cultivation in the world, and these are 2 coffees from Yemen. Beautiful, interesting, fascinating cups here. We're going to start this one with Maghrib Ans. When it comes to coffees from Yemen, there is a very, very strong sense of flavor profile that attaches itself to the origin, to the terroir of the coffee, of where it's grown. This is partly due to the heritage of cultivating coffee in Yemen, and it being very much the same thing over the last hundreds or thousands of years. The way that Yemen people grow, process, cultivate coffee has largely remained unchanged. the importer for this coffee, Kima Coffee, has come into Yemen, and they're starting to take over the processing side of things. And they're adding a lot of genetic testing, they're adding a lot of traceability, and they're adding processing techniques that have never been done before in Yemen. And that is starting to alter some of the characteristic flavors that we come to expect from Yemen. And with this coffee, this Maghrib Ans, is a stalwart example of that taking place. This is a wild one. If you are familiar with Yemen coffees, Yemen flavor profiles, this one's going to take you on a wild ride because it really, to me, doesn't taste hardly anything like what I expect from Yemen. And that's owing to the carbonic macerated honey process that this coffee undergoes. So in Yemen, there's very, very little to no water that's available to process coffee with. That's why basically all coffee from Yemen is natural. They don't have water to be able to do a wash process. And so with this carbonic maceration process, they're able to, again, not use any water in that processing, but they're able to change the dynamics of the coffee quite strongly. And finishing this with a honey at the end, again, to not have to use any or very much water in the processing of this coffee. So that really changed the flavor profile of this coffee. And it is something that's very unique, very interesting, and I would say very singular as being something that I've very rarely tasted notes like this in a coffee before. And the notes that I have for this are sea buckthorn, jasmine, and black tea. So starting at the top, sea buckthorn, this is a berry that comes from a bush, and it's very tart and a little bit earthy, and in the cup with what I'm tasting, it also offers a very tartaric type of acidity to it. A green grape could probably have made it onto the bag in place of sea buckthorn, but I wanted to represent a little bit of this Yemen character for black tea and a little bit of earthiness. It's lightly present in this cup, but as we move through the notes, it becomes a little bit more apparent. Next up is jasmine, and it's sort of a nice florality that's to this coffee, a little bit of a green tea-like sense to it, and finishing with black tea, which is very emblematic of Yemen coffees in general, and again, presents very cleanly here. There's not a lot of earth or that earthy component that Yemeni coffees are sometimes known for in this coffee. Moving from that tart sea buckthorn berry kind of grape-like tartaric acidity on the front through this green tea sort of jasmine sense into a black tea finish is such a unique and dynamic experience. This coffee is just singular in that aspect, and it's really quite playful, and the sugariness sort of attached to the tartaric front end of that acidity is really quite lovely, and then it just switches on a dime and turns into tea-like flavors with the jasmine and the black tea finish. It's such a dynamic cup, really fun, really quite clean today. I'm really enamored with this coffee. I'll also say a fair warning to folks who have bought this coffee or are buying this coffee. When you open and crack open this bag, you are going to think that this coffee roast, my work on this coffee, has been botched. It's a very, very dark looking bean. I owe that to the process here, the carbonic macerated honey, but I assure you, when you brew this in the cup, it tastes exactly the way that I intend it to taste. Wild and dynamic. If this is your first exposure to Yemen coffees, this is not what most Yemen coffees taste like, and I would say you need to start with something like what our next coffee is, and then try something like this to get an idea of what makes this coffee so unique. And without further hesitation, let's move on to the last coffee of the drop. This is Al Obrah Special Reserve. Nice. And when it comes to Yemen flavor profiles, this Al Obrah is much, much more in line with what most folks would expect. It's a heavy, sweet, syrupy cup with a lot of dark fruit and dried fruit flavors to it. Kima Coffee, again, handling the processing on this and ensuring the meticulous nature of the process results in a absolutely stellar, best of type flavor profile in this coffee. This certainly meets expectations for flavor profiles from Yemen, but it elevates that by presenting an extraordinarily clean cup for the notes that are being listed here. This is, in short, the best Yemen coffee that I've ever tasted. It is emblematic of the Yemen flavor profile. It hits all these dark berries, these dried fruits, these very, very, very sugary notes. It adds a little bit of a pastry-like sense to it, sweet pastry, and a little bit of florality too as well into the finish on this. And the combination of all these factors, I think, does result in something that is truly exemplary when it comes to Yemen coffees. Yemen flavor profiles are so singular and they attach themselves so strongly to the origin of the coffee. There's nowhere else on earth, I think, that these types of notes could present themselves so well in. And this is just an extraordinary example of something that can only be found in this region of the world. This is from Yemen Takhilia. I'm trying my best to pronounce that well. And it's a Yemeniya. It is a natural process, and I think I've messed up the label. I think I wrote washed on there. It's not washed, this is natural. Oh boy. And the notes I've got listed on this one: blueberry cobbler, fig, and fig blossom. Blueberry cobbler, just imagine dark fruits, blueberries, cherries, maybe a little bit of raspberries in there, in a cobbler with a very sweet pastry-like crust. Moving into fig and fig blossom. Fig, date, any kind of dried fruit, something with a lot of sugar content to it, and then a very pleasant, sort of floral-like finish with the fig blossom, something that's a little bit lighter and not quite as representative of a dark dried fruit, but also not really a floral character like we might talk about with the Arashi. Sensational, it's so sweet, it's clean, it's got a tiny bit of Yemen earthiness to it. It does have a little bit of that. It has a little bit of a black tea-like into the finish, but I think that the notes listed are so much more dominant in the cup that they really take over. It's an exemplary coffee. I do think this is probably the best Yemen I've ever tasted. The representation of the notes and the cleanliness with which they're represented in the cup really stand out. There's nothing that's really covering up notes or just feeling like it's holding anything back in the cup. And it's like an endless amount of sweetness that's available in this coffee. Really spectacular, really beautiful. Rest recommendations, brewing recommendations, and the like. Okay, back over here with the El Tropico. Despite this being a pretty long roast with a high finish temp and a profile that would indicate a light roast on it, I've gone ahead and labeled this as an ultralight roast. Reason being that I think that it's going to need a little bit more rest to open up. Despite it being a very sweet and sessionable coffee, I think rest on this coffee is going to be needed for it to really open up and to provide the best cup possible. And so I do recommend probably about a 20-day, maybe up to a 30-day rest on this coffee. This morning I brewed it with the Gabby Gentle recipe. That's a 12-gram dose, 200 grams of water. Go a little bit coarser on my grind versus the Gabby Standard recipe. Everything else is the same as I always brew. That really does well with this coffee, as this coffee doesn't have a lot of complex florality to explore, and pushing really high extractions on it isn't really going to benefit it. So it's a little easier to brew in that respect, a little more accessible to a wider range of grinders, waters, brew methods, and things like that. Okay, Arashi. So Arashi is lighter than it was last year. This is definitely an ultralight roast. This coffee has a lot of floral complexity to it. It has a lot of sweetness complexity as well to explore, and a very strong, sort of shocking lemon limeade acidity up front. And for that reason, I recommend a pretty steep rest time on this. I would say 30 days at least, and maybe up to 40 days on this coffee. If you had this coffee last year and you found your sweet spot in terms of rest and dialing in and the brew method that you used, I would stick with the same brew method, but I would add maybe 10 more days of rest over whatever you found to be the peak for you. It is definitely a lighter roast over last year. So I have a 40-day recommendation on this for rest. And this morning I brewed it with the Gabby Standard recipe that provides a lot of flavor separation. It opens up the complexities, allows me to explore all the individual components that are sort of dancing around in this cup. And I think it's really great brew method for this. Lemon limeade, it's very, very clear. As this coffee rests, I think it's going to open up the possibilities for brewing different methods, different ratios, and things like that, pushing it in different directions. There's a whole lot of information in this coffee to explore. And with rest, I think those different types of things are going to open up and provide a lot of fun in this coffee. All right, Maghrib Ans. Both these coffees from Yemen are listed as light roasts, and as such they have a little bit of a lower rest requirement or rest recommendation from me. The Maghrib Ans in particular is a darker coffee than a lot of H&S ultralights or lights. Even for a light roast, it's a fairly dark coffee, and so I think 15 days could work on this coffee. Maybe 20 days is a little bit of a better recommendation for this. It's going to present its notes pretty quickly once you crack into it, and it's going to be something that presents a lot of interesting tea-like characteristics as it rests. This morning I brewed it with the Gabby Gentle recipe, 12-gram dose, 200 grams of water, and I really like where it's at. I like the way it's presenting both the sort of tart sea buckthorn on the top, a little bit of that grape-like tartaric acidity, and then the tea-like notes into the finish. It's all pretty cohesive. It's kind of all presenting a little bit together. It's like a switch that flips pretty quickly, moving from the acidity into the tea-like finish. And this is going to be a unique one. I'm not really sure how it's going to present itself at different extractions, or for instance in espresso. Looking forward to trying this one on espresso. I think it's going to present some very interesting and unique dynamic character to it once I get there. Finally, Al Obrah. Again, this is a light roasted coffee, and as such, it's going to be ready a little bit quicker than these two over here. It has such a sweetness dominant character to the cup that I think it may be opening up a bit quicker. As a light roast, I would say again, 15, maybe 20 days is a good recommendation on this. This one might be ready pretty quickly. And I think as it rests, it's going to just continue to provide different types of sweetness, a lot of different complex dried fruit-like characters into it. And the florality on it may open up with higher extraction type brews. But this morning, I used an extraction yield minimizing recipe. So I really wanted to keep a high TDS on the extraction with a little bit of a lower extraction yield relative to that. So this is a 1:16 ratio with a 15-gram dose and a 240-gram total water. And that really pushes the sweetness on this coffee, giving it just a wonderful big punch of sweetness to it. Really an excellent, excellent coffee. One of my favorites so far this year, definitely. So, all right, I think that's it for today. This is probably a very long video with a lot to go over. Enjoy these coffees this month. Really another stellar month from H&S, and we're gonna leave it there. All right.